Welcome to the Water Resources Podcast. I'm your host, Bridget Scanlon, from the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. This podcast is produced in partnership with the National Academy of Engineering. In this podcast, we discuss water challenges with leading experts. Hi, everybody. I'm pleased to invite Dr. Paolo D'Odorico to the podcast today. And Paolo is going to talk to us about water and energy linkages and global trade concerns. Paolo is a professor of natural resources at the University of California at Berkeley, and he received his PhD from the University of Padua in Italy. He has published several books, including Global Deforestation and Dryland Ecohydrology. Paolo is a fellow of AGU and has received many prestigious awards, including the Sustainability Science Award from Ecological Society of America. Thank you so much, Paolo, for agreeing to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
And could you give us a brief description of your work and a little bit so prepare for the discussion?
Yeah, sure. I'm a hydrologist, so I was trained mostly as a civil engineer in the beginning, and with a focus on hydrology and the natural system. In the last few decades, we looked at the interactions between water and the biota and the role of water in determining ecosystem functions, so a whole field that is now called ecohydrology. And more recently, I started looking at the role of water in human societies, more at water resources and the questions related to sustainability, water sustainability, and the way they intersect with the food and energy security.
Thanks, Paolo. And I think we'll be focusing mostly on the latter part of your work in this discussion. And I think in one of your studies, you indicated that although in the past we've put a lot of emphasis on natural systems, that most systems are not natural anymore. And so we need to look at the human impacts and understand the linkages there between water, food, and energy. So, Paolo, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the increased energy prices globally and potential impact on food security with grain trade supply chain issues with the Ukraine war, Russia-Ukraine war, and also with countries stopping exports like India and some Southeast Asian countries. And also the impact of energy prices on fertilizer production, because some plants in Europe have had to greatly reduce their production, and so that also impacts food production. So how do you think this is going to impact the trade of food and food security globally? And this is not the first time we've had a food crisis, and then what have we learned from previous food crises around 2008, 2010, 11, and earlier?
Yeah, first of all, what we learned is that the food system is strongly globalized through international trade. And so we estimated that about 25% in terms of food calories are accessed through international trade on average. Which means that when there is a shock in one part of the world, particularly in a breadbasket like Ukraine or the entire area of the Black Sea, there are going to be some impacts that are going to affect not only that region, but far regions of the world. So the easiest thing for us to do at this point is to look at what we learned from recent cases of recent food crisis. In 2007, 2011, there was another important food crisis. It was caused by the increasing demand for food and energy products, in particular also the demand for biofuels in a period with some crop failures in some parts of the world. And so that led to an escalation in food prices. There was at the time some countries reduced their exports substantially to prevent or to control the food prices domestically. And this led some other countries in other parts of the world in a condition of panic. So in the case of the 2007-2011 food crisis, Ukraine reduced its wheat exports by 80%. And also Australia reduced its exports, and the wheat prices were having a shock or a spike of 100 by 150% increase. As a result of that, well, many parts of the world were affected by this global increase in wheat prices, but particularly affected were the regions of the Middle East and all the way even to other African countries like Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and on the other side, instead, it arrived all the way to Pakistan. And overall, there was an increase in food prices. Of course, this is particularly serious in case of developing countries where most big part of the income of a household is spent in the purchase of food. Then there was another important food crisis in 2010, 2011, and that in that case, Russia reduced its exports of wheat. Belarus reduced the exports of rapeseeds, and then Argentina they reduced the exports of soybeans. So overall, there was a reduction in a slowdown of the international food market or market of agricultural products. There is several studies tend to support the idea that this was one of the contributing factors to the Arab Spring. And so clearly, what we are seeing today, fortunately, some of the trade from and the exports from Ukraine has resumed, is a situation not very different. It affects the same area of the world, and so it's a very critical supplier of food globally.
That's very interesting, Paolo. And I think, when I was looking at the data, it seemed like natural gas prices spiked in those years, like 2008 and 2011. And then that impacted and tripled the fertilizer prices during those times. So that would also be a contributory factor. And also, I think you mentioned in some of your studies, the effect of dietary changes with the increasing middle-income countries, they're shifting to more water-intensive, energy-intensive diets. Maybe you can describe that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this is an important factor. So there is a crisis in this particular situation, a crisis of supply. At the same time, there is a very high demand, and the demand for agricultural products has been increasing, and not only because of population increase, but also because of affluence. Often comes with an increasing consumption of animal products, which require much more water, much more land for their production on a per calorie basis than plant food. And so this altogether, this led to an escalation in the demand for agricultural products. And also we are at a point where in the previous decades, after World War II, there was this strong enthusiasm for the Green Revolution because it allowed an unprecedented increase in the production of food. But now clearly other factors that are not only nitrogen supply and soil fertilization, other factors which are simple as land and water become limiting in our ability to sustain an increase in agricultural production. And this, combined with an escalating demand by human societies, brings us to this very first global food crisis after decades of excess in supply.
Right. So that's extremely interesting. So, I mean, food trade sort of helps to resolve spatial disconnects between supply and demand. But then if you're an importing country, you can also be vulnerable if the exporting country reduces their exports during critical times. Can you explain how the globalization of food trade has evolved over time? And, I know it's been going on for decades and it's been increasing, particularly in the last couple of decades. Maybe you can describe that a little bit, Paolo.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting aspect of the way in which the global food system has been changing in the last few decades. And of course, it has, as you are indicating, there are some pros because at this point it's possible to sustain the demand in regions of the world where the supply and the production is limited even by natural factors. At the same time, there are some vulnerabilities because there is dependence on on a production that is not controlled domestically, but is abroad and is accessed through international trade. The food trade system has been changing over the decades. Right after World War II, there was a strong control of the United States that are a major producer of grain, and this grain production was partly sustained by subsidies domestically, in a way that the US government was supporting and sustaining a production rate that exceeded the domestic demand. At this point, the US had to place these products in the international market. Right after World War II would have been through the Marshall Plan, and that included some provisions for the European countries to purchase at discounted rate grains from and wheat from the United States. At some point, then the European countries started to protect their domestic production, and the US started to divert this surplus to other parts of the world, mostly in the developing world, which of course had the impact of displacing local systems of production or limiting their ability to develop, because of the fact that there was this competition by relatively cheap grain from the United States, subsidized by the US government. And this led to a condition in which if we look now at the distribution of the so-called yield gaps, the gap between actual and potential yields, we see that some regions of Africa and Asia still have a relatively big gap, because again, the lack of development of agriculture, partly also inhibited by this competition with by exports from the US.
And so these developing countries then can't compete with the subsidized food that's coming from the developed countries. So that's really is a little bit unfair, and then reduces their ability to develop their own domestic supplies, as you suggested.
Yeah, and makes them more vulnerable to situations like those we were talking about, in which there is an export ban, and then at this point they don't have enough domestic supply to meet their demand, and so they are more vulnerable than they would have been in the absence of this competition with the subsidized products from the United States. And so, but that led to this very central, the US played a very central role in this globalization of food at the beginning. At some point, even Russia started importing for some period in the early 70s grains from the United States, because of a crisis of production in Russia, which had the impact of creating again an escalation in food prices. And then we kept going over time, and at some point, the other big change we can see is that when China, from a self-sufficient country, started importing soybeans and staple crops from mostly from South America. At that point, this is partly related to what we were talking about before, the increasing demand for animal products, and so a lot of this, much of this soybean product imports is used as a feed for the livestock industry in China. At this point, if we look at the global redistribution of agricultural products through trade, the US is not central. It's still an important one. It's number 2 in terms of exporter, but South America is a major exporter, and is also much more integrated in the global food market, trade market of agricultural products. And so this has been overall at this point we have 25% of the food commodities that are accessed through international trade, which is not a trivial amount, clearly.
Right. And I mean, I think some of the South American countries are a bit unusual in that Argentina does not provide any subsidies for its agricultural production and actually taxes them. So, I mean, so they're competing at a different level. And then the increase in trade from South America corresponds to the agricultural expansion in that region, and then deforestation and impacts on the environment from the agricultural expansion that I think corresponded to soybeans and then herbicides and pesticides and, you know, all of these things, making large-scale production feasible.
Yeah, the whole region of the Cerrado, for example, in Brazil, has been undergoing major land use changes from grazing land to agricultural land. A lot of loss of these savannas, which also have an impact on habitat and also on greenhouse gas emissions. So some of the impacts of this trade are affecting the producing country to the benefit of the importing country.
It was interesting. I was looking yesterday at where Brazil gets a lot of its fertilizers, and a lot of it in the past has been from Russia and Germany and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how they're impacted by current issues with the Russian-Ukraine war and energy prices in Europe. You also, I think, have studied quite a bit the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, and its impact on linkages between the US and Mexico, and what effects that has, trade there has on water issues and land and stuff.
Yeah, we've been looking at the production of vegetables and berries, the so-called healthy diet in the United States, to what extent this requires resources that are in Mexico, including land and water resources. And so one thing we noticed is that since the mid-90s, there has been an escalation in the production of berries in Mexico and in the imports to the United States. With no exaggeration, most of the imports of these berries, US imports are from Mexico, more than 90%. And so this happens in regions of Mexico where there are limited water resources, where water resources are depleted, in particular the groundwater. And so there are some environmental impacts of trade and some externalities that have remained for a long time understudied, and most consumers are not aware of the environmental impact of their consumption habits and where these impacts happen.
So, Paolo, just when you tell us not to eat meat and to eat more veggies and stuff, but then we have to consider where the vegetables are coming from. So it's quite a complicated system, and it can lead. It's difficult for a consumer to figure out, you know, what's good, what's bad, or whatever, because you have to consider the source and the climatic conditions at the source, and whether it's irrigated or not irrigated, and those sorts of issues. So this leads, you know, you just lead into this issue that when you trade food, then you're also trading water. So this virtual water concept and water footprint. Can you explain that to listeners and what it entails?
Yeah, in fact, when we were looking at these impacts, and one of the impacts is on water resources, and you were alluding to the fact that some of these products use irrigation water, deplete water resources, etc. So the notion of water footprint has been introduced by Arjen Hoekstra to define the water cost of a given commodity. And his focus has been on agricultural commodities, because most of the water consumption by human societies is in agriculture. And so it's possible to calculate how much water is needed to produce a kilogram of wheat, a kilogram of meat, and so on. And so what we find is that the water consumption for meat production is orders of magnitude greater than the water consumption for plant food. So this is a good metric to have an idea of the hydrological impacts of our consumption habits. But as you were indicating, we don't know what are the environmental impacts associated with this consumption of water, because if a commodity is produced in a place where there is plenty of water, without depleting surface or groundwater, the environmental impacts are relatively small, at least in terms of water consumption. There are other impacts associated with soil erosion, pollution from fertilizers and pesticides. And so it would be important to have a metric of water footprint that accounts for the type of water, if it's irrigation water or rainwater, and where this water is taken from, and to what extent this happens at the expenses of environmental flows or groundwater stocks. Then
so I mean, the water footprint concept has been hugely beneficial in people understanding, you know, how much water it took to grow that food, and it's not included in the food right now, but it was evaporated when the crops were growing, and so. And then the source of the water, you know, whether it's surface water or groundwater, and the conditions at the source are very important also. But the water footprint concept oftentimes doesn't extend to that level. But I think it's advancing now to consider the source. If you're producing the food, for example, in the US, we produce maybe 60-70% of our vegetables from California, and then export them to the rest of the country. And the Central Valley in California is essentially a desert. So there's an awful lot of irrigation water used to produce those food items, you know, for the domestic market. And that, of course, leads to overexploitation of groundwater resources. And so, I mean, it was interesting to me, there was a World Wildlife report recently that said, could we move the Central Valley to the Mississippi Basin? You know, could we move the food production in the Central Valley? And I mean, it's a lot more complicated than just doing, you know, thinking about growing the plants in the Mississippi Basin, but you also have a lot of socioeconomic issues, labor force, migrant labor force, and all of the things that have evolved over time in the Central Valley to support that agricultural production.
Exactly, and also the type of production and the type of agricultural products is produced in one region is not necessarily suitable for another one. But for sure, this brings us to talk we can talk now about the notion of virtual water, which is very strongly related to the notion of water footprint. As you noticed, the water footprint, the water is not contained in the apple or in the kilogram of meat, but it's water that has been used in a consumption process that has been evaporated. But by trading one commodity from one place to another, so by shipping almonds from California to another part of the United States or the world, virtually we are transporting that water. And this notion of virtual water, which was developed by Tony Allen, has been a very powerful framework to look at the globalization of water. How the globalization of food through trade is associated with trades of virtual water. This water is not physically present in the commodity, but virtually is as if it were transported with a commodity from one place to another. And so this means that some parts of the world depend on virtual water imports. And the typical example Alan used was, again, the Middle East, because there are so many people in the Middle East with very limited water resources that that water would not be sufficient to feed that part of the world. And the reason why this is possible is because of the import of grain from other parts of the world, which, according to Alan, this is an import of virtual water. He quantified that virtual water, and which is greater than the flow of real water down the Nile River. So this is a very effective way to give us an idea of the magnitude of this phenomenon. We said 25% of the food on average is traded, and similarly 25% of the water used for food production is virtually traded from one part of the world to another. So through this virtual water trade, we can really look at the water resource, where the water resources we use as consumers come from, and where the hydrological impacts of consumption habits are perceived and are happening.
Right. So I think that's very important. This virtual water, which was used to produce the food, and it's not actually embodied in the food at this point, but it was used up or evaporated when we grew the food. And so I think then, because 70% of global water consumption or 90% of global water withdrawal is for irrigated agriculture, then there's a big emphasis on making agriculture more sustainable. So people have talked about the concepts of more crop per drop, or, water efficient irrigation systems, flood versus drip systems and stuff like that. But I think there's also a paradox associated with that. And maybe you can explain that a little bit, Paolo.
Yeah, it's called the irrigation paradox. And it's basically if a farmer maximizes the consumption of water, and so for a certain amount of water that is applied through irrigation, most of it is transpired or evaporates into the atmosphere. It means that very little of that water drains down to the aquifer or can contribute to surface runoff. As a result, when farmers switch from a surface irrigation based on canals to a drip irrigation, which is has a much higher efficiency, this efficiency has the cost of reducing the flows of water down to the groundwater or to the surface water bodies. And so as a result, while at the farmer scale, this efficiency leads to an improvement in water use, this means that downstream, other users will be left without or with less water than before.
That's extremely interesting. And I think there was a paper by Alan MacDonald and his co-authors in Nature recently about canal irrigation in northwest India, greatly recharging and building up groundwater supplies in that region over decades from the early 1900s. And it's only recently where they've switched to groundwater irrigation that they've started to deplete, the last couple of decades that they've started to deplete the aquifers. But I mean, they built it up over decades. So, and I know talking to some folks in Australia, like Quentin Grafton, that precision agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin, they spent $5 or $6 billion, but they didn't consider that in lining irrigation canals or these sorts of things, that then they were that water infiltration from irrigation canals was not a true loss, and then when they didn't take it into account, then they saw the impacts later during drought. So we have to consider the interconnectedness of surface water and groundwater, and what is the true loss in the full water balance in a basin, not just at the farm field.
Totally, because if we maximize the if water leaves the land masses either as evaporation and transpiration or runoff, if we increase and enhance the evapotranspiration, then we have a loss in surface and groundwater runoff. So then we really don't gain anything. We just consume upstream.
And then I think, with these increasing efficiency in irrigation, many farmers expanded their irrigated areas. And so then they ended up consuming more water through evapotranspiration. And so it was the net benefit to the system at all. These highly efficient irrigation systems, just Pulido Velasquez and others showed that early on in the Southwest US, so very important to consider all of these different aspects. So, we talk a lot about food production, irrigation, import, export, and global trade. And so I think considering the energy prices now, fertilizer shortages and all of that, I think a lot of countries are concerned about food security. And in the past, they've also had those issues. So what are some of the ways, you have written in detail about land grabs and countries purchasing land in other countries to increase their food security and also possibly water security. Maybe you can just define what land grabbing is and then what the implications are of these processes.
Sure. The land grabs are the acquisitions of land, and usually large tracts of agricultural land that happen in conditions of unbalanced power relations without involving the current land users, or without a democratic process, without even a symmetry in information between those who lose control over the land and those who gain the control over the land. And in the most extreme case could be also done with forced eviction and violence. And so in these conditions, the land is taken away often from marginalized groups in the developing world. And typically the investors are agribusiness corporations, could be government-owned companies, or could be also investment funds. And there's been an increase in what's called sometimes the land rush since the food crisis of 2007, 2008, because of the fact that some countries who are not self-sufficient in terms of food production wanted to have a more direct control over some agricultural land to secure access to food. So the typical narrative that is being used is that in some parts of the developing world, the yield gaps are big, and so the land is not used at its maximum potential. So because of lack of investment in technology, because the innovation of the green revolution has not been adopted, and so because of that, it's possible there is the need for some agribusiness corporation to make the investment the local farmers have been unable to make. And so invoking often the logic of food security, even international organizations have been sometimes supporting this type of investments. But of course, and the theory is that because of the fact that there are investments in some regions of the developing world through these land acquisitions, there will, according to the so-called trickle-down approach, everybody will benefit. The reality has been that often the farmers lose access to, of course, to the land. We replace the subsistence farming with large-scale commercial agriculture. And so the production in this acquired land is for the export market, and the local communities don't have access also through these food commodities through the market. The other problem is that in many cases the land has been left idle or not cultivated, and was being purchased just as an option for the future. So without even bringing the type of investments that were expected to happen, or it took a long time for this land to be developed. So the interesting part of the story is that the investors are often interested in the land not because they don't have land domestically, but because of lack of water in their own home country. And so this land grab is often associated with the water grab, with an attempt to appropriate water resources for agriculture.
Yeah, I think some of your work, you were describing land grabs along the Nile River, Sudan and other regions. And so I guess that they're very interested in the water resources in those regions also.
Definitely. In fact, we have shown in some of our study that the acquired land usually has a preferential access to water, even in terms of distance from surface water bodies or distance from underlying groundwater. The investors also tend to target countries that are not expected to be strongly affected by climate change. The whole world will be affected by climate change, but in terms of water availability for crop production, these regions would not be strongly affected. And so there is clearly an attempt also to invest in land and in order to invest in water resources.
So I think, one of your recent studies where you're looking at new dams that were constructed over the past couple of decades, and you were looking at land use change adjacent to those and irrigation and stuff. I think you found that it was most of the land was appropriated by large agribusiness, and the smallholder farmers were squeezed out. And then it seems like in those countries, maybe they're producing luxury items, I mean, like flowers in Kenya or things like that for export market. So it doesn't seem to enhance the food security in those developing countries, and doesn't seem to help.
Yeah, so the way water grabs can happen, it can be either through the acquisition of land or to the development of an infrastructure on a river, or can be an infrastructure on a river, or can be a well in the aquifer to extract water and have a control on the access to those water resources. And the development of new dams the construction of new dams for irrigation in Africa has been followed by the emergence of new irrigated areas in the surroundings of these dams that are mostly larger scale farms, not small scale subsistence farms. So this means that those who benefit from this larger scale infrastructure usually or often are the agribusinesses, not the rural communities. And as you're indicating, some of the production is for more luxury products. Can be flowers, can be sugar cane, not necessarily staple crops. So overall, by doing this, the traditional users of the same water resources lose access to that water. There are several examples. It's been very well studied, the case of the Omo River in Ethiopia, where the communities, the pastoral or agro-pastoral communities downstream from the Gibe 3 dam lost access to water resources. There is a lake there, the Turkana Lake, that as a result of this agricultural use of water upstream has been shrinking with loss of fisheries on which the local communities were depending.
And so, I mean, if this process, these large agribusiness doesn't improve food security, how do you think food security could be improved in Africa? Do you think you can help the smallholder farmers improve food production and try to close the yield gap with fertilization, limited irrigation, and small-scale processes and decentralized water stores, things like that? Do you think that has potential to improve food security in those countries?
Well, clearly, if there are relatively big yield gaps, the closure of those gaps will really help with an increase in production. And there have been two approaches. One approach would have been the green revolution or technology-based approach, so bringing the fertilizers, irrigation. And again, this is possible only up to a certain point. If we look at water resources, there is a limit to where the irrigated agriculture can be expanded because of lack of water resources locally. And the other approaches instead are based on low technology, more labor intensive, but based on polyculture, still some irrigation, and the use of more labor to sustain higher production, the use of organic fertilizers, non-industrial fertilizers, and local, instead of the big dams, small-scale detention ponds for irrigation. And again, less technology is required also by approaches that try to plant the right crop in the right place. So avoiding water-demanding crops in regions that are water-limited, and improving the crop suitability, also the right crop on the right soil, in a way that it's possible to increase the production without requiring these big investments in technology that are not easily accessible by smallholders.
And I guess, maybe crop rotations and stuff could help with the nitrogen balance, and then trying to improve the soil health and these sorts of things could go a long ways to improving crop yields.
Definitely. In fact, those more traditional methods, it's a whole field that is called agroecology. It tends to focus more on these, let's say, less industrialized methods that sustain soil microbial diversity and crop rotation, and also approaches that try to use to farm the land in a way that there are less evaporative losses from the soil, in a way that water is conserved to sustain crop production.
Like no tillage.
Like no tillage, cover crops, and these are the methods to reduce soil evaporation.
Right. And also, I think soil erosion, because many of these regions are subjected to floods and droughts, so it's a sequence. And so anything that can protect the soil cover and from erosion and would go a long ways to improving soil health and crop yields.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, that's very important to sustain, to have some sort of sheltering of the soil surface from the action of wind and water, in a way that the soil is not lost and the nutrient-rich part of the soil is sustained.
So we've been talking a lot about, human-centric subjects like everything for humans and stuff, but we've also got to consider the environment. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of the needs of the environment, environmental flows and other things. Has much of your work focused on those aspects also, Paolo?
Yeah, we've been looking in the past at aspects related to land use, loss of forest cover, the extent to which this is affecting the land, the processes of erosion, habitat, to what extent this is affecting also the hydrological processes, the intensification of or increased exposure to floods, the loss of environmental flows, as you were suggesting. So all these aspects that are important. Also, to what extent the loss of forest cover or other types of woody cover can affect, can be irreversible, to what extent this is leading to a permanent loss of habitat, which is also very important from the point of view of the way in which very important for the human health, as we are now in this global pandemic. We always tend to look at the health of humans separate from the health of the environment and health of animals. Deforestation has been shown, and forest fragmentation have been shown to be important drivers of the transmission of pathogens from wildlife to humans. And so we studied the case of Ebola in Africa, also coronavirus. This is work I'm doing with my colleagues, Maria Cristina Rulli from Milan. We are looking at how this impact on the habitat has an impact also on the spillover and the transfer of pathogens from wildlife to human.
And I think, it also has a big impact on water quality. I mean, New York City preserves the forests covering their watershed so that it results in high quality water. But for example, Sao Paulo, it was a lot of deforestation, and then that results in sediment yield and with erosion, and impacts treatment systems and those sorts of things. And then the nutrient loading that comes with agricultural expansion. So there are a lot of trade-offs to consider to optimize land management, and people are very concerned with trying to improve water quality upstream of major urban settings and those sorts of things.
Yeah, there is, in fact, the case of Brazil, for example, is a very interesting one, because there is the attempt now to restore the Atlantic forest. exactly to improve that, to bring back some of this environmental quality, and this is a major reforestation effort. At the same time, other parts of the world, we talk about planting trees, and in areas that were not even forested initially, or at least in recent times, and this can have other problems related to the water resources, then depletion or reduced availability of water resources downstream. So sometimes we deal with a system that is some sort of a short blanket. So if we look at the problem from a larger scale, we realize that on the one hand, looking just at the food system, which has a strong environmental impact, there is a minimum amount of environmental impact also or impact also on water resources that is needed to feed the world. At the same time, there is also the concern that we might shift or we might reach some tipping points if we encroach too much into the space that should be left to nature. And
right.
So this
and
is
yeah, and I
so
think one aspect of nature that we should be is wetlands. You know, they serve a huge role in water quality and quantity, and flood mitigation and those sorts of things. I think you know, many urban areas, they developed over the wetlands, and then they're much more prone to flooding now, and maybe now they're considering restoring some of those, and this green and gray technology, combining those to try to improve water systems.
Yeah, these are ways to go back to look at the function that the biota plays, in the specific case in controlling the hydrological processes, and instead of relying only on gray infrastructure, we can go back to some of these functions and plant trees, or use the natural environment to restore some of those environmental services that are very important for water resources, for environmental quality, control of pollution, and flooding.
Right. So we've talked about a lot of different things, and I guess, you know, it'd be nice to try to, and we've talked about some solutions to different issues like smallholder farming and food security in Africa. It seems I often think about, you know, trying to resolve water issues in terms of a water budget. You know, if we have shortages, increase supply, reduce demand, store more water, or transport it. And I think in terms of water and food, we oftentimes consider just increasing supplies of these things, and don't focus so much on reducing demands or conserving or things like that. What are your thoughts about some of the solutions that we can use to resolve spatio-temporal disconnects between supplies and demands?
Of course, I totally agree on the fact that we shouldn't focus only on increasing the production and the supply, because there is a limit to that, and probably we are reaching really that limit. And so it's time to look at the consumption, our consumption habits, how we consume. If we look at food, how we consume food, and to what extent we can switch to a food system that is less demanding and requires less natural resources, less water, less land. And the first thing we can think of is the food waste and food loss, which according to some estimates accounts to between 25 and 30% of the global food production. Of course, we will never be able to reduce it to zero, but we can limit that. This can go down to our individual behavior in the way we buy and consume food at home, but the whole system can also be restructured and reimagined in a way that can be more can reduce that waste, or if any food is wasted, it can be reused, can be to produce energy, to produce to fertilize the soil, or or as feed for livestock, for example. So the other big one, of course, is the consumption habits directly as the type of food we want to eat. So we already talked about how meat and food and animal products are more demanding. Perhaps a diet that is less demanding would be, and for sure would be allow us to substantially reduce our pressure on the environment. And interestingly, while the meat consumption has been increasing, the type of meat that is consuming is more sustainable. There is a shift more to poultry and pork and less beef. And the footprints, not only in terms of water, but also of greenhouse gas emissions, land use of that type of meat is much less. So that's already a good sign. And that could be also part of a conscious decision on consumers.
Right. I think, in the past, I was doing a lecture tour maybe about 15 years ago, the Birds All Rice lecture tour, and I was saying that most people should become vegetarians and stuff. But then some people would say, well, it takes about a gallon to grow an almond in California. So maybe it isn't so water intensive. Maybe poultry production is not so water intensive. So we need to consider where the food is grown and the environmental conditions there also. And I think we're trying to track things back to the source and the environmental impacts, and that will help us understand what's critical. And I guess, intensification versus extensification of agriculture. I mean, we have in very technology-oriented areas, vertical farming or protected farming and things like that, very energy intensive, but highly productive, and maybe more of a circular economy where we recycle the water and the nutrients and things like that, But we've got to consider all of these things. And I think that's what's marvelous about your work, is that you cover the gamut, you cover things from all sides. So, and consider the trade-offs, because most of us just look at one aspect and then we just tout that. But it's very important to consider greenhouse gases, as you mentioned, and water and land and all of these things.
And energy as well, right? So we can...
Yes.
There is a whole thing world there that we requires to be improved in a way that the new energy system that is not very competing with the food system and is not demanding water resources in areas where they are not available.
Well, I guess that gets to sort of the biofuel question. People have used various terms, cars versus carnivores, or food versus fuel and things like that, So, but that's mostly reflecting, maybe first generation biofuels or maize or corn grown in the US and things like that. But Brazil has, I think, done a terrific job of their biofuel program and have a strong chemical industry related to it. And most of the sugarcane that's used for biofuel there is grown fairly sustainably, it seems like.
Yeah, but at the same time, we did some back of the envelope calculations. If the biofuels require too much water overall, so we will not be able to replace fossil fuels with biofuels. This is why we will need to look at renewable energies that are not based on fuels, and this could be solar, can be wind, or something else. But hydrologically, there will not be enough water to solve the energy problem only with biofuels. As you are suggesting, also for the food, in the case of energy, most likely it needs to be a combination of different methods, different solutions, and it's going to be a mix of all of them.
And so one aspect that I think you have written about a while back is, do we have much food storage to resolve temporal disconnects between supply and demand? Have those stockpiles of food been decreasing? I've seen this in some of the food crises, that our stockpiles of food have been decreasing over time. So we can't turn to those then in time of crisis. Is that correct?
I think it's important to maintain food stocks and grain reserves. In fact, what helps us in situations like this one, where there is a major crisis affecting a breadbasket, having access to reserves that can cover the supply for several months is really crucial. And so there have been different ways to measuring these global food reserves, because there's some disagreement in the data and the available data. But what is important is that when you simulate, even in a model, a food crisis, having a food stock makes a big difference, and allows to meet the demand despite the reduced or supply from some of these producing regions.
I guess it's just like water storage, we have surface reservoirs, but also groundwater provides a large store of water as a buffer then during droughts and things like that. But I guess the biggest issue with energy is that we can't store it, or not effectively yet. So that really highlights the differences between these different things, water, food and energy. I really admire you, Paolo, for working with a large team of scientists and collaborating with various people and talking to economists, decision makers, policy makers, and really sleuthing through data sets to get the data. It's not easy to get data to address many of these topics, but you seem to do a great job of synthesizing the current situation and global issues. And what's next on your agenda, or what are you looking at these days?
Well, first of all, I have to say that this work is always a work of a team, and there is a lot to learn from these collaborations with colleagues from different with different expertise, and so that's a part of the fun of working on this research. Right now, we are still working a lot on this notion of water grabbing, looking at different pathways of water grabbing that are associated with not only with acquisition of land, but also other ways through which it's possible to gain control over water. And I'm also more interested, increasingly interested in looking at this interaction between the human rights to food and water associated to the rights to food, and the rights of nature, the way in which we can recognize some through by recognizing some the value of nature by itself, independently of it being instrumental to human action. We can find a way to meet both rights, and to what extent instead these two rights can be in competition between the two of them. And so there are interesting cases of adjudication of these rights between nature and humans.
Well, that sounds fascinating. Well, I really appreciate your talking with us today and sharing your insights on globalization of food trade and virtual water related to that, and then potential solutions to addressing some of these issues. And I hope the current situation won't turn out to be so dire, but at the moment it just doesn't look very good. And hopefully, I think developed and high and middle income countries will be able to address that, but the developing countries, I think, are the ones that may suffer the most. So our guest today is Professor Paolo D'Odorico from the University of California, Berkeley, and thank you for listening.